So I think we've had quite a diverse range of speakers today. So have we got any questions, any burning questions for any of the speakers or all of the speakers at once?
Thank you. You talked about revenue, you talked about risk. Isn't the risk to us as a sector, if we end up in 10 years' time as a multi-billion pound builder of green infrastructure that will always be chasing the cheapest solutions, the easiest peat to work on, the easiest way of doing it, and frankly, cutting corners. And I know we'll say, no, we've got the Peatland Code, we've got regulation, but will the regulator be prepared to detonate a multi-billion pound sector if it's delivering plenty of revenue, regardless of whether or not it's delivering those other benefits?
Thank you. Who'd like to take that one?
You want to take a couple? Or
yeah, okay, we can take a couple of questions first, maybe. Yeah. Let us think about that one. Thank you.
I've got a nice, easy question.
Oh, good. We'll start with that.
So, Matt, why was Nestle invested in? Why were they the buyer for the Moss at Buxton?
Yeah, so that was something we learned with them, actually. So one of the things that site was capable of was water retention, and Nestle have a water neutrality pledge. They own the bottling plant for Buxton Water in that catchment, and as part of their organisation, they have a water neutrality pledge around retaining water in the natural environment alongside their extraction. So they were really interested from that perspective. What we had to understand about that was how did they need to evidence that, and who were they reporting to? And they have targets, they have KPIs that's administered through the World Resources Institute, and we had to get on a call with them and try and actually understand what it was. What was that pledge about? What were the metrics they needed to evidence those things? And it was interesting that that colleagues at Nestle didn't necessarily know how to do that either, and nor did we. So it was a bit, of bringing it together and exploring that. And I think that's part of this. Partners, I think, that are motivated to do this will hopefully be motivated in the right way, partly addressing the previous question. And I guess we get to decide who we work with, and if it's the right scheme for the right place for the right reasons, and you're happy that it's going to be high integrity, then we can engage with it. And I think understanding that is a process that has to be gone through in that development phase, and that's kind of what we did with that one.
Thank you. Renée?
Yeah, coming back to the first question, I think that's why having standards and having that rigorous process behind it is really important. And not just the Peatland Code, but like I showed, as a Peatland Code, we are adhering to these national and international standards, like the International Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets our application at the moment is 160 pages. So that shows you how much, how rigorous that is. But I agree with you, it is a risk that we have to mitigate, and that's why it is a complex place to be in. But yeah, if we do it right, it can work in my eyes.
Thanks, Renée. Yeah.
Just to add to that, the first question was a great question. I think the opportunity of thinking about these different revenue or income models is not to cut corners on cost, but the opposite is to get more money into peatland restoration in the first place. That can do two things. First, you can then restore it to a higher standard, and then the other thing is you can restore more of it because more sites become viable. Very roughly, I think there's 2 or 3 million hectares of unrestored peatland in the UK. Even if it's £1,000 per hectare to restore, which it's not, it's more than that, but just say that for numbers, that's £3 billion. There is not going to be £3 billion provided by the public or philanthropic bodies in the next 10 to 20 years. They haven't got the money. So if we want to scale up the ambition, we'll have to we'll have to find new sources of the upfront capital, making it easier for developers so that you get the capital all at once. But that requires thinking about the income that then comes afterwards. So that's all it is. But I think it's to underscore, I hope, the shared ambition everyone has, which is to do more and to do it at higher quality and with more outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Matt. Yes, please.
This isn't meant to be antagonistic, but it's a question that always comes up for me. Is like, in the example with like water companies, at the moment they're already paying for like peatland restoration within their land, etc. And you talk about the model of water companies, paying for that sort of benefits they get in the future. But what doesn't come up often is like the polluter pays kind of bit of like, there's a lot of landowners that have got this land that is emitting a load of carbon. They benefit from the carbon credits. They get the work done, generally paid for by other sources. Obviously, there's a precedent with agri-environment schemes, etc., that normally pay for public benefits. But yeah, there's not that other bit within this landscape. And I think it obviously ties back to that agri-environment sort of background. But if you've got that example with, say, water companies that are paying for work on their land, yeah, where is that other polluter pays element, particularly linking in with even like flood risk, etc.? It doesn't just have to be carbon. Yeah.
Anybody for that one? Matt.
I can see where that question's coming from. In the context where we work, I would think about what the drivers of degradation were in the first place. And within the context of the Peatlands and South Pennines, there's a real legacy of atmospheric pollution from industrialisation in Sheffield and Manchester. So some of that emissions, that you're talking about, is over very long periods of time, and I guess the polluter pays principle won't put the billions of pounds on the table unless and the landowner, land manager isn't necessarily why that peatland is in a bad condition. That it's diffused over an entire landscape, and it was an entire landscape in our region. So I think it's about, for me, it's about just facing into it and doing something about it. The world's not perfect, but all human activity, all economic activity has contributed to the state these peatlands are in. And for me, I'd like to intensify the amount of investment to restore them. And for me, that should involve absolutely everybody that has a stake in seeing those landscapes in a much better condition. So that's, it's not necessarily kind of resolves that question, but I guess that's my perspective on that.
Thanks, Matt.
I haven't got a great... I think Matt's right. It depends how far back you go in history. Looking forwards, though, I suppose the interesting angle in your question is to what extent should we make some of these markets compliance-driven or voluntary? Because I suppose the more compliance-driven they are, the more you're basically mandating that people who degrade the outcomes have to then buy them somewhere else. That's happening in local areas with planning and biodiversity in the UK. It's happening with the big industrial polluters with carbon through the trading system, carbon trading system. Doesn't happen with all the other businesses trying to hit net zero, and it doesn't happen with water outcomes. So that, I think that's the other way to think about it, is what's the kind of degree of obligation to do this from companies.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. So we have 2 minutes left. Any quick questions? 2 quick questions over there.
Hi. How do we get them to pay for sector development? Because we're all talking about getting more money for restoration, but we've got a big problem in upscaling. And the gentleman up there kind of touched upon it as well, about regulation. Regulation needs to upscale. Training of staff needs to upscale. We've got big issues with that. If we're going to suddenly morph into this £1 million infrastructure industry, we are going to need a lot of money to make that transition. What appetite do investors have from that? Because my experience is they like the shiny things, they like the deliverables at the end, they like the restored bog, but they're not necessarily so keen on the process to get there.
Matt, sorry.
I mean, at the most simplest, they don't have anything to invest in if there aren't people doing the hard work developing the project. So good investors realise that, and they will they will put money into the project development, the pipeline development, and the organisations behind that. May not feel like that now, I guess, but that's partly because there isn't any private capital flowing, hardly.
Matt, you wanted to?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's right. Like, one of the hardest things to fund is the monitoring and the communications. They're absolutely vital. We all know this. And we're always asked, what evidence have you got? Well, you didn't pay for any evidence gathering, so, that's actually pretty difficult. And I think what I would suggest in terms of how we could think about this is think about it in terms of the cost of restoration. So, I'm simplifying, but if we were to say, okay, it costs X per hectare, and you put a number on it, within your team and your context, and knowing what it is that you need to deliver that hectare, if that is inclusive of absolutely everything, build all of the monitoring in it, build all of the MRV, monitoring, verification and reporting into it, build the comms into it. So then you're able to say the true cost of restoring that bog is not just the capital part, it's all the team, it's your training, it's your kit, it's your monitoring equipment, it's the whole lot. And then you're not going back, oh, can we have a bit for this? It's like, I don't, we shouldn't be unapologetic about it. I think cost it in. Like, if it's going to be commercial, we can be commercial too, and make sure that things stack up properly, so that you've got a project that you can deliver and that will deliver the outcomes.
Thanks, Renée.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think you're absolutely right. I think what you're just saying is that we should all be doing that, and we should all be doing that a lot better. The other thing is, if we get more private finance in to pay for the restoration, it leaves, there is public funding, so if we can make the public funding pay for, like, if we can free some of that up to actually upscale and get that more into the industry, so the industry is ready to actually do this, that's also a way that we can look at it, and that's the de-risking, and there's loads of things that public funding could do in a different way, and this is absolutely one of them as well.
Can I just add something on that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So if the public sector funding, we know that's it's vital, and particularly in this period of transition, if we're going to move towards this. Take advantage of it. But I suppose it's also thinking about, are there other ways we could use that money? So, for example, on the Coombs Moss project, we were really fortunate that the EA had communities at risk of flooding down from there, and they were really interested in the flow outcomes. But they actually helped fund the baseline monitoring setup 2 years before. So even when we were in the development phase and we hadn't kind of got something over the line, we were able to get the monitoring all paid for. So it might be that actually the public finance in future, that could come in and help us do the monitoring, verification and reporting part of it, with some of this more emerging kind of ways of funding things, heavy lifting being done by the other sources of funding.
Great. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, everyone. So thank you very much to our panelists and the questions. And